Can everyone see the agenda?
Yep.
So welcome to the OmniBOR community meeting. We do this every Wednesday at 8 a.m. Pacific time. Just quick check through. I don't think anything terribly interesting is happening on events. Did we ever find out anything out about a cloud native security village for KubeCon, Frederick?
Yeah, I was told that they do intend to do something, but the details were still being worked out. So right now it's just a matter of waiting, and we should have more details later.
Okay, let us know if they get their act together.
Yeah, it was like this last time as well. Like they organized it pretty late in the game, so and we're able to make it happen, but it was, yeah, it had me a little bit stressed out. So
yeah, I understand. I mean, I actually understand both ends of it. It is a lot to organize a thing.
Yeah,
so later ends up being better, but at the same time, it would be good to get things in a row.
Yeah, no blame on them on that. They did an amazing job. Amazing jobs can still stress me out sometimes. So
this is the nature of the world. So do we have anything else? So anything else on events that folks want to bring up? Okay. Any updates on community outreach? All right, so up next, POCs and questions from implementers.
So Ed, I think there was a note somewhere I saw that you had reached out to somebody in the Python community. So Yankwi and I have been having a lot of discussions around Python, and we have a particular interest for a project in that. So
I was trying to reach out via Julia, but that ended up not bearing fruit. So if you're interested in reaching out towards the Python community, that would be fantastic. Also, if you've got something you'd like to share with the group about what you're planning on doing, that would also be lovely to hear, although don't feel compelled.
Okay, yeah, we're just trying to figure out like the best way to generate, ADG for like an interpreted language like Python. I mean, we're looking at various paths here and trying to figure out the best path. So I know
Robert Marion has done some work on that in this group.
Right. And we
so
took a
you
look
definitely
at that.
should check with him. Yeah, definitely check in with him. Also, and this is a little counterintuitive, but I know DPP has also done work on Java. And the reason I bring up Java is that even though it's not an interpreted language in the same way that Python is, the thing that makes both Python and Java tricky is actually the dynamic loading rather than the interpretedness, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
So I don't know if you have any wisdom to share, DPV.
So I think the big thing is, at what point do you compute a gitoid? Or off of what do you compute the gitoid? Do you compute it off of the source file that was loaded? Or the source file on disk, because, hey, there might be line ending changes. There's a whole bunch of stuff in terms of, kind of where you compute things and when you compute them. I'd be more than happy to chat offline, or if we want to have an agenda item, if we're not too packed today, to talk about the approaches that I've been thinking about in Java, although not implementing, because I actually have this other project that I'm getting paid to work on. So that trumps things that are unpaid.
Okay. The other thing for us, I think, is dependencies, figuring out dependency chains. So the dependency thing, I think, at least if I were to do Python,
I would do it at load time. So each of the things that is loaded, put a hook in the Python interpreter, figure out what's loaded, and emit some sort of getoid or whatever for the thing that's loaded, and see if that can be tied back to package time getoids and your dependency graph.
Okay. Yeah, I don't want to eat up too much of our time here, but I mean, there are several factors that would influence that, I think. So it's definitely a topic that we're exploring and interested in ideas about. So go ahead.
Yeah, it's very courteous of you to be concerned about the time, but there is a reason that POCs and questions from implementers is the top of the agenda. We take it very seriously, and it is actually very important stuff for us to talk about. So, but yeah,
I think this also brings up the broader topic of TypeScript and other languages that go through a series of transformations before they hit execution.
So, forgive my naivete, maybe I've been mismodeling this in my mind, but my mental model of TypeScript is that it's essentially a compilable language that compiles down to JavaScript, generally speaking.
So it compiles down to JavaScript, but there are things like Dino, which is a node alternative that will load TypeScript natively, and apparently does whatever the compilation is at some point before the execution happens. There's also the question of, do you actually want to care about an AST, generating a getoid off of an AST walk? And I think of an AST as something not dissimilar from a Java class file. So I think that there are places where you're going to take a snapshot between source code and thing that's being executed in the environment. And you also have the issue of LLVM bit code. Not all LLVM is pre-JITted. Sometimes it's actually JITted. It's distributed as bit code and then JITted on the target environment, which is actually the reason that LLVM was invented, so that Apple could have a single description of stuff for their plethora of graphics cards, and then have that rendered down into the GPU's native stuff. So we have a lot of these interesting variants where things become increasingly less human readable. And at what point during that transformation process do you snapshot a getoid of a thing and then publish that getoid of a thing, or compare it against a published graph?
So I think to a certain extent, there is latitude left for the tool author. So take your example of Dino with TypeScript, right? From our point of view, Dino is a runtime. It is a runtime that happens to consume TypeScript. Now, what internal machinations that Dino does with it, it may or may not choose to capture as part of the ADG for what it's doing. My guess is, because engineers are lazy, it's what we pay them for, but unless there is some extreme benefit in doing so, they will just act like what they consumed was TypeScript and not worry about the intermediate pieces.
But that then, so if you have a Dino instance that's running TypeScript, and you have an instance that's running a, I'm blanking on the package manager.
NPM?
No, there's a package manager. There's a pre-compiler in JavaScript land. Well, Google Closure is a good example. Mm-hmm. So Google Closure will take JavaScript and turn it into a much more efficient and compact JavaScript. That is a compilation process that yields an intermediate result that's still the native grammar. So if you're using message pack, it's not message pack, what is it? I don't know, there's like some JavaScript packaging system that will take all of your JavaScript libraries, run them through a phase that does stuff, then run them through the Google Closure compiler. In that case, that particular tool will run the TypeScript to ECMAScript transformation. There's also various different levels of ECMAScript or JavaScript transformation, from the more modern ones that have, promises and await and all of that sort of stuff, that are ultimately translated into ECMAScript 5, which are these deeply nested functions. So once again, there are these transformations. There might be different levels or layers of the transformations depending on the packaging system that's chosen and the runtime system that's chosen.
Yeah, so, I mean, the ones that I sort of see as mandatory are the ones that end up being persisted to disk and thus potentially passed off to some other entity. So, for example, a minifier in JavaScript essentially takes JavaScript as input and writes JavaScript as output, but it's clearly not the terminal component in that conversation, right? When I sit down and I'm running a minifier against something, and then I'm going to go and distribute the JavaScript that's the result of the minification, like clearly a build step has been had, and that's very analogous to what happens with a compiler. It just so happens that the output format is the same as the input format, and it's just a simple transformation.
It is, but then I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think this gets to the idea that the point of having Gitoids for anything and having the artifact dependency graph for anything is to be able to do comparison of some sort, to say, are these two the same? Where's the distinction? And if you have things that aren't persisted somewhere, then there's not really as much of a basis to do a comparison. So I feel like that, I don't know, I feel like I'm kind of agreeing with Ed here that there is flexible, there should be latitude for the tool authors to say, like, hey, if we think it's useful to to have a Gitoid and have a manifest for this, to do that. But in general, to say, like, it really should be done at the very least for the things that are persisted.
Okay, so I agree with that. However, if I am doing a build, let's say I'm a big company that runs some Node.js servers and some Dino servers. I may have two separate persisted builds that come out of my TypeScript.
Yeah.
For the Dino stuff, I might actually just say, look, I'm going to zip this up and give it to you, and you figure it out. For the Node stuff, I'm going to go through whatever the machinations of packaging steps are for the Node stuff. So I may have two artifacts that come from the same source.
Mm-hmm.
If we, let's say, go in and do some patches to Dino to say, look, when you're loading raw TypeScript, emit the same kind of Gitoids that I'm currently emitting from the class loader example that I did for Java. Okay, that's fine, because those two things should actually be similar. In other words, the source and the thing that Dino is looking at should be similar. If, however, we're taking that same code and sending it to the browser, that's going to be pre-digested, and not. And so, how do we make sure that the browser, assuming that at some point we do Gitoids in the browser, we do a patch to Chromium and do a patch to Firefox, and say, by the way, when you load JavaScript, emit these things. How do you tie those back, given that you've gone through a lot of the compilation steps? And this may get into the discussion that we were having about attaching comments within the code.
Yeah, I mean that I think it gets to that, but I think that we're getting a little bit lost in the particulars of individual languages. You brought up something good with a generalization of the persisted notion, because essentially what we're really talking about is the build tool going to distribute an artifact? Because sending the resulting JavaScript to the browser is a distribution event, and persistence is a distribution event. And so we may want to think a little bit more generally in terms of not just persistence, but distribution, i.e. handing it off to someone. It just so happens that the most common way we hand something off to someone else, or possibly hand something off to someone else, is to persist it to disk. But it's not intrinsically the only way we could do so. Does that make sense?
I think part of the thing that's missing here as well is the why at the end of all of this. So there are some use cases that are about security and provenance. There are other use cases that are about efficiency, caching, where perhaps the provenance there isn't as important because we care about the final result, but perhaps the step of delivering it to the system may have already been accomplished and it's in the process of running it. And there may be caching efficiencies that it can pick up, but perhaps not. Perhaps it's not about security at that point. So I think part of what we have to be careful with is not to assume that all the use cases are going to have the same end goals. Because how you treat them will be different based upon the goals that you have.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. So we're now go ahead.
Maybe the thing to do, and I'll do this and then drop the ball on it like I did the last time. Create a discussion topic in the OmniBOR space, which is kind of what are the various different transformation and distribution use cases we can think of. And maybe if we start enumerating them, we'll start finding common patterns. And that might help us in, I like the demarcation of distribution. So if we use that as a demarcation, what are those common demarcations? How can we package things for distribution that include some sort of computed gidoid or tree or reference to a tree? And if we have that conversation, I think a lot of the TypeScript and Python and PyC and Java and bytecode things will start falling out, and we'll see the commonalities. Does that seem like a good course of action?
It seems like it seems like a very beneficial course of action, because one of the things that I've noted over the course of my career is that people engage with things at different levels of abstraction. And I happen to be a hyper abstractor, which is super unhelpful for dealing for communicating with people in some circumstances. And so enumerating these things and sort of then walking the concrete up to the abstract is probably going to be very, very productive from a communication point of view.
Okay.
So, okay. On the how does OmniBOR benefit folks? I don't know if we've had any further conversation. Does not look like we had further conversation there. We should probably get on that in terms of documenting some of that stuff. On the metadata for OmniBOR discussion, I think we have further down a PR number 50, which has been merged. I think, yeah, PR 50 has been merged. Is this discussion closed out with the merging of the PR? Do you have an opinion on that, Bharathi, since you opened this issue up?
Yes, I think this was mainly about the location of metadata file, and that has been agreed, and we can close this.
Excellent. Just wanted to be sure. I like closing things. All right. Do we want to talk about governance at this time, or do we want to continue sort of moving down things? We don't have Ava here right now.
I think the metadata discussions for 54 is still open. The one above, isn't that?
Let me take a look. Oh, the naming of metadata file. Okay.
So in this regard, I just wanted to, we discussed this last week. So I just wanted to share the implementation that I made. So can I just take 2 minutes to?
Oh, absolutely. No, absolutely. Please. Let me stop sharing and let me fix the security settings so you can share.
Let me try. So yeah, you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, so this is just a simple example where I set the OmniBOR environment variable and I compile a file hello.c to its object file, and then take the hash of the object, which is the output artifact. In this case, it's hello.to. So this is the gitoid for the output artifact. So based on what was discussed, we discussed several options of how to store this metadata. So I just use the artifact ID and under the location that we just closed in the PR, which is the OmniBOR /metadata/context, which is LLVM here, and whatever is the metadata goes into this file. And the only point that I was just trying to discuss was there were several cases. Data file could be the gitoid of the input manifest, or the output artifact, or the name of the output file itself. So I captured all of those points in that GitHub discussion /54. And so basically, the metadata file like this, which is a textual representation of the input manifest besides other information like the build command or anything else that we would like to capture. I know Frederick mentioned that he's been working on capturing different kinds of metadata. Look at that and get some ideas. But for now, as a first pass, this is what I did.
Excellent. No, this looks good. My tendency personally is towards what you've done here, which is using the idea of the artifact to store the metadata. It makes it easier to find it.
Yeah, the only like I pointed out in that discussion, the only odd case would be, suppose if I compile this with O1 and O2, and it can result in identical output artifacts. So that this is also not entirely free of conflicts, but yeah, we could choose to either concatenate. We need to discuss some ways of mitigating it, or clang-13 and clang-14 for a particular source file could generate identical output artifacts. Even then, the metadata for that artifact could slightly differ.
Okay.
Manifest would likely be the same, but yeah, there could be subtle differences in what we capture as metadata. For example, licensing or something else also. The metadata can be slightly different, but the output artifact can be identical. In which case,
I'm sorry, what? I didn't hear you.
so again, that I'm saying there could be potential conflicts in such cases. Like different ways of building the same output artifacts.
Yeah, that is true.
Or we just concatenate everything.
Do other folks have thoughts? Hello?
Yeah, so this is what I had. We could continue the, I've enumerated all these points in that GitHub discussion. So, you know, we could discuss it.
Yeah, let me get the GitHub discussion.
Yeah, sorry, her audio was dropping out quite a bit for me, so I missed a lot of that. I might just be having audio issues on my end though.
It was also getting fainter and then louder and then fainter and then louder quite a lot for me as well. Although I think I did catch much of it. But I think basically effectively what it comes down to is that if we go and we stick the OmniBOR ID into a file that is named after the OmniBOR ID of the thing, the way it's currently implemented, then we might have some potential for stomping of metadata between two different runs. The question I would ask though is the following. If I have two different runs that produce the identical output artifact, then it's in principle possible for the metadata differ, but how would I know if that makes sense? Because if the output artifacts are byte-wise identical, then does the difference, to what degree does the difference in metadata matter?
So, well, in production, I could be using one version of the compiler, and I just want to preserve that in the metadata.
Right.
Well, yeah.
So by production, you mean like you're doing a release build of a thing?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess, yeah, I have to, yeah, in practice, whether this collision is, whether it matters or not, yeah. Unless you know, you build different ways in the same, you know, like you use the same.
Your audio is still getting very faint about half the time, Bharati.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. So essentially, yeah, whether in practice this matters, I'm not entirely sure. It may not be, yeah, it may not be a cause of concern.
Yeah. To one of your comments, Yonkui, in the chat about assuming the metadata files do not affect build reproducibility. I think you're basically making the same point I am, which is if I've got two different runs of the build that produce the same output artifact, then you know we could essentially just pick whatever the last metadata file was for that. Does that make sense? Okay. And then Yonkui commented, yes, exactly, for build reproducibility. Okay. My gut feeling is that we should be okay with the output artifact ID as the file name, and it makes it very easy to correlate information. Because if we have the artifact and we want to go look for its metadata, we can go look for its metadata.
Right. I also agree. So I think I just, for completeness, I listed everything, but it may not be a cause of concern.
Good. And there's some other comments from Yonkui about the actual format of metadata files. And I don't want you to feel like you're being unheard on that topic, Yonkui. But I think effectively, since we've effectively said the metadata file format is up to the tool implementer, that is something to sort of work out separately, alignment of metadata data file formats. Does that make sense? Cool, awesome. So Youngquay says, yes, that makes sense. And let me actually change this item to being its own item here and edit it to be and so that way I can mark the one above as closed and we can remove it from the next discussion, but we still retain this discussion going forward. Everyone good with where we stand for the moment on metadata file naming?
Yes.
Cool. I want to jump down to the update to better reflect the input manifest language, if we could. Because I've made the change for transitive closure that was requested there. And I wanted to check in with Andrew because one of a few things has happened. Either A, I've completely missed your grammar pass in the comments, which is always possible. Or B, you have determined that my grammar is fine as it is, which strikes me as unlikely. Or C, you have been busy and have not yet gotten to it. And I just wanted to make sure that we sort of
I haven't gotten to it. This is a good reminder. Here, actually, I'm gonna make a note to myself to do that today. Because yeah, I think otherwise, I mean, I just even right before this was kind of going through, and I think in terms of the content, it's looking pretty good to me. So it just needs the grammar check.
Yeah, and quite honestly, I actually find it somewhat comforting that you have not found my existing grammar and not in need of some copy editing, because that would determine that I've used up all of the improbability in the system for the day, and probably for the rest of the week. And that's always disturbing. Okay, so I wanted to touch on that because I think we're very, very close to getting that merged. So comment insertion on OmniBOR IDs. We had gone through a lot of stuff here. And I apologize. It looks like I probably needed to have processed some of these comments before today for discussion. And I have not done so. For those of you who may not have been here for the previous discussion, this was essentially an attempt to capture an Annex C, where we talk about how to embed OmniBOR IDs. And now that it's starting to come back to me, there was a fairly good argument, if I recall, for putting them at the end of the file. Or rather, oh, okay, this was actually the consensus. The tool may choose where to embed the ID so long as the pattern is followed and we agree on how to interpret the multiple lines. Okay, yeah, but it does look like there was some additional input that I should have provided here in response to Andrew's comment.
Yeah, and just to elaborate on that, since we're there for that point, the point of what I'm saying there for the tooling is basically to say, and this is just imagining some CLI, it doesn't matter if it's specifically that interface, but just to say that when you have the possibility of there being multiple manifest IDs that are embedded within a document, and you have some official rule that says sort of which one wins, it is still helpful to have some sort of ideally standard tooling that allows people to sort of double check their assumption on which one they think is winning for a particular file, to say, we have a thing that we know implements the spec correctly for deciding which one wins, and you can run it and it will tell you what it is decided the manifest ID is.
I completely agree. And this is actually sort of, there's a collection of things that are sort of like this in terms of convenience tools that I think are probably very useful to put together. I know I had started beating a few of them out in Go. Please don't take that as a squatting on territory, because it's been a little while since I've had a chance to get back to them. But the idea of being able to say things like, you may recall when I put together the library stuff that you rather liked, Andrew, and Go, in terms of the structure of the, okay, that we're going to compute these things, we're going to find these things, et cetera, for the getoids. A lot of that was sort of related to, okay, what would I want as a CLI in order to go through and quickly extract the information here. So
yeah. Yeah, so I definitely think there's work to do on tooling, and obviously, like the idea of having a tool here doesn't have to block anything. It's more just a sort of note for myself, if anything, to say, I have certainly had instances where I'm reading something and I'm sort of misinterpreting it, and having the ability to have something to check your assumptions or check your expectations is really valuable.
Well, look at the way we all abuse the git hash object command. The very first thing I always do when I'm checking to see if tooling is working is I take up a collection of things and I run git hash object in order to produce the appropriate hashes, and then I stick them in as unit tests.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
Because one thing I'm reasonably certain about is that Git is right about what getoids of things are.
Yeah, no, actually, the testing point is a good one in particular. So with OmniBOR, that you could imagining such a tool exists, or sort of a library that does the same thing, can then put that in your tests to say, hey, make sure that the getoid of this thing hasn't changed, or that the input manifest information for this thing hasn't changed.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And correct me if I'm wrong, Barathi, you had a number of relatively good reasons for sticking the comment line at the end of the file, if I recall.
Yeah, end of the file, because it's just easy to seek to the end of the file and just write the OmniBOR ID there, as opposed to inserting a line at the top.
Yep.
And then you have to put all lines. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, and then we had come around to the embedding question again, and I had brought up there sort of this new idea towards the end of of 2 weeks ago, on a new non-embed mode idea, and I just briefly introduced it, and I was kind of curious. I wanted to sort of bring it back up again to see if any of this had sunk in, if folks had other ideas. And essentially what I did is I went through and said, okay, well, we've been talking about this non-embed mode for a while. And, the real kicker for embed versus not embed mode is you have to have something to tie the output object to an input manifest. And it needs to be something that can be picked up and read by other tooling. And we've experimented with things like very complicated link directory structures and a bunch of other things. And one of the possible things I was sort of toying with was just have the built tool write out a simple file, possibly in the same directory, that is just an output file for the OmniBOR information for that particular output file. So if foo.o is the name of the output file, and foo.o has an artifact ID, and foo.o has an input manifest ID, then you would write out a file in the normal format that basically says, okay, blob, the artifact ID has a BOM of the input manifest ID. And that was sort of one thought that was running through my head. Now, the simple version of this idea doesn't address the dual tree. And I will be upfront and say that I'm not sure that I think the .omnibor suffix is a good idea. So maybe something more, please throw rocks at the omnibor suffix. I actually don't like it, but it was sufficient for communicating the idea. And then the other piece I sort of stuck in here was one offhand idea for handling multiple artifact identifier types would be to adopt something like the YAML document separator standard. And so in that OmniBOR file, you could just concatenate the two separated by triple lines. Do folks have thoughts, ideas, etc.? This is a very preliminary idea, but particularly for folks who have been thinking about the embedding stuff for a while, I'd be very curious.
I mean, I'll say like the kind of separator of the 3 lines certainly seems reasonable to me. I know that, obviously so it comes from YAML, but I know that I've seen it in other places. I feel like also sort of inspired by YAML. Yeah. So this is specifically about dealing with the fact that you can have multiple manifests depending on whether you're doing SHA-1 or SHA-256.
Well, it's basically, effectively what it comes down to is that this was just sort of a random thought about how to deal with the multiple artifact identifier types. So they're not really different. They're effectively different representations of what in principle should be the same information.
Right.
But you need them dual tree. Now we have a comment in the chat from Youngquay saying, I think SHA-1 and SHA-256 should be separate documents. That way it's easier to generate SHA-1 or SHA-256 only, which is fair. Please note, we don't envision these particular files ever being hashed across, but that doesn't change it's a good comment from Youngquay.
Okay, yeah, so that gets to what was going to be my question. So these are files that we don't anticipate ever needing to themselves hash to serve as sort of points in something else's artifact dependency graph.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think then that would answer the one thing that I was sort of concerned about, which was if you are needing to hash it, then you have to do a sort of like pre-hashing step that would need to be very well defined for splitting up the file into a conceptual sort of standalone SHA-1 part and a SHA-256 part. I mean, I guess you wouldn't have to, but then it's like you have a distinction that's happening that's sort of artificial in the hashing between if you generated a combined file that has the SHA-1 and the SHA-256 versus if you generated just the SHA-1 or just the SHA-256. But if it's never hashed, if it never appears in something else's ADG, then I don't think it matters. Like that, I think this is fine.
Yep. So this is the other thought that occurred to me, is that you might try something like, and again, all sort of directory placements we can discuss. I don't know if folks can see what I'm sort of typing as I go.
Yeah.
Which artifact ID? Output artifact ID?
Yep.
Okay.
That clarity is useful. So this is sort of capturing another idea, which is you could potentially just have this as a separate capture of metadata for the mapping. So you basically say, okay, well, you've got, and again, mapping's a terrible name, so don't take that seriously. But you could essentially capture those documents independently, to Youngquay's point, indexed by the output artifact ID. And if we just make that a general specification of how you should probably be outputting that information, then it's something you could check for in the non-embedding case. Do folks have thoughts or opinions or?
Okay, it looks like Youngkwee's saying that the bombshell symlinks looks kind of like this.
Okay. And just a quick check, Barathi, I presume this wouldn't be terribly painful.
Yeah, I think this is doable. I can try to prototype this as well.
Yeah, but both in terms of writing it out and also in terms of if you don't find an embedded ID, checking for something shaped like this.
So this would be enabled with an environment variable or an option, or?
I think the answer to that is probably yes. And we've had some past discussions about the potential for that.
Yes. So I mean, this again needs to be standard across all the build tools. So it needs to be a part of the spec.
Yep, this is something we would need to standardize, yes. Although it's something that does sort of fail semi-gracefully in the sense that if a build tool for whatever reason hasn't implemented this in terms of non-embed mode, then yeah. But I think, yeah, I think we probably want to move the non-embed stuff up into the actual spec itself, so we have some clarity. And this actually has an interesting characteristic, now that I think about it, in that even in the non-embed mode, if you have access to an OmniBOR DIR, then I could ask for something like, back to your point, Andrew, about CLI is like an OmniBOR, 80 GLS or something like that. And I could actually go and walk through and figure all these things out and lay them out.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else that folks want to discuss on this front for the moment? I think a lot of this may actually be a bit, the rest of the things to discuss here may be a little bit stale, because I think there's been a lot of revision in movement since the NXA comments. So I think we may be at a point where it might be better just to yield back the last 5 minutes today, unless there's something other folks would, something else folks would like to discuss.
We can take those 5 minutes and use them for copyrighting review.
That is much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah.
And again, it's very comforting to me to know that I did not magically stumble into that degree of improbability.
It would be impressive.
Particularly for me, I have a real tendency in that direction towards that kind of problem. All right, talk to you all next week.
All right. Thanks.